What's going on, guys? Coach Bronson here, and this video is going to be a review and some of my thoughts and notes that I took in regards to a new video that came out by another influencer about low-carb diets and exercise, carb cycling explained, and if we need carbs to perform exercise and be physically active. So you guys have heard me talk about this before, but there's a lot of context around the information in that video, and we come to some similar conclusions. The idea about carbs being useful and a tool, but I think we get there different ways, and there's some context and nuance to the information. I want to make sure that we're clear on how this stuff works so that we can really understand how to apply this stuff to the right scenarios. Okay. There's some information that we're going to go over that may be new, you may have never heard before. So hop on in and let's have a chat. All right. So a couple of days ago, I don't know, maybe within sometime this last week, a friend of mine, Mike Muscle, Metabolic Mike, he's a fantastic guy, great influencer in the space, has so much good information he's been putting out over the years. And he put out a video called Problems with Low Carb Diets and Exercise, Carb Cycling Explained. Very good information. A lot of good stuff in here as far as helping you understand uh, if your level of intensity and volume warrants a need for carb supplementation. Not everybody needs it. Some people, if they're working hard enough, you're getting uh, a lot of volume, you're doing a lot of intensity. Carbs can be helpful from a performance perspective. Carbs can be helpful from a competitive, if you're competitive perspective. If you're a competitor, it's very it's very possible, and in many cases, I would recommend that you train ketogenic and work on becoming metabolically flexible so that when you perform your sport, you can ingest some carbs and help get that boost of performance and energy because it's great for that. So there are use cases from a sports performance perspective where carbs can be helpful. Okay. And I just want to make sure that he goes over a lot of stuff in the video. It's about a 30-minute long video. He goes over a ton of stuff, and I just took notes along the way. So I want to make sure that everyone's understanding how this stuff works. And if there's questions about some of the things he says, because some of the things just I want to explain a little bit better. Okay. So as we go through, I'm not doing a side by side. We'll just talk through this. If you want to go watch the video, I'll put the link in the description. But I'm just going to go through the notes as I saw them, so I don't have like time hacks when he said all this stuff. Just watch this video and then watch mine again, or however you want to do it. Okay. All right. So the first thing that I noticed when he was talking about outliers who perform well on low carb diets from a sports performance perspective was that he was talking about, he referenced Dr. Baker, Rob Sykes, things like that himself, and saying that, there are people who perform well on low carb. My question about that, just based on my experience, is are they really outliers? I perform fantastic. I've performed better being low carb than ever before in my life. I've worked with hundreds of people over the past several years who all have worked better the less carbs, the fewer carbs that they ingest. So my question and something I want you to think about is think about your own experience. Do you perform better? Does your body work better? Here's the thing: it's hard for us to say. I don't see the logic in saying we are more metabolically healthy without carbs, but then we can't perform well without carbs. Metabolic health, metabolic function is defined by your physical ability. So if your physical ability is limited by not having carbs, then you can't also say that your metabolic function is improving without carbs. Those two things don't work. Right? Something to think about. Okay. I don't think people like Dr. Baker. I don't think people like Rob Sykes, myself, Mike Mutzel. I don't think these people are outliers. I think they are the norm based on my experience. Again, I've worked with hundreds of people. I see the same thing over and over and over again. Cut out carbs, perform better. Happens all the time. Okay. Something to think about. In the video, Mike talks about carbohydrate intake needs to match the demand of the training or competition. Okay. I totally get that. And this is one of the things I want to, he's basing a lot of this conversation on this study or on this paper that was a review of a bunch of information. And the point of that paper is not evaluating our body's ability to process carbs or create carbs. It's about the impact of carbs that we eat. So the base assumption of this paper is that we have to ingest carbs. Okay. So that right there kind of puts me off on the side of, well, is this paper even valid? If we're talking about we don't need carbs, but then we're looking at and talking about and evaluating the paper, that's making the assumption we are eating carbs because we need to eat carbs. I'm not sure we're making a comparison that actually fits the lifestyle that we're trying to live. That makes sense, right? The premises are different, so I'm not sure how they apply. All right, so something to think about there. The idea, I would like to change that statement from carbohydrate intake matches the carb demand of training or competition to glycogen availability needs to match the demand of the training or competition. Because then we're talking about the source doesn't matter as much as long as it's available. Okay. Because we know that our body can create glycogen. Our body stores glycogen. Our liver stores glycogen. Okay. So we have processes in our body. Carbs are not essential because our body can make glycogen. So if our body is providing glycogen for our activity, then carb intake doesn't matter. Something to think about. Okay. A couple of times he talks about downsides to exercising in a low carb state, right? Again, this is the same kind of thing. I think when we talk about a low carb state, and we'll talk about this further on because he often compares, he says fasted state instead of low carb state. And I think he's using the two interchangeably. I could be wrong, but I think he's using the two interchangeably and they're not the same thing. So the downsides to exercising in a low carb state, again, I don't see any. I've never seen any. Okay, there is something that we can talk about when we talk about the adaptation period, and we'll get into that a little bit later in a couple other points, but it does take time. And the biggest issue that I see with people who are trying to exercise and do physical activity as a fat adapted person is they don't give it enough time and they don't give themselves enough fuel. So if you are doing things actively and you are low, especially if you're lean, you need to eat more fat. You need to fuel that exercise. Okay. So that's something to think about. Remember, a low carb state is not the same as a fasted state. We'll talk about that again. He references the 1976 Olympics. More carbs showed better performance. I'm not sure that that's an applicable point to argue in this discussion because he even says that up until that point, the assumption was that protein was the primary macronutrient used in physical activity. And so now we're saying that they were looking at protein versus carbs. When they took in more carbs, they performed better instead of taking in more protein, performing better. So the change in the societal shift of going from protein to carbs, I don't know how we can use that as a case for carbs when what we're talking about is being fat adapted. So we, as people in the ketogenic space, as in the carnivore space, who are saying fat adaptation is better than being a carb-fueled athlete, saying that being a carb-fueled athlete is better than being a protein-fueled athlete, again, the premises are different. We can't use that as a comparison. I don't think that's a valid argument. Okay, something to think about there. Carbs are the primary fuel oxidized for prolonged physical activity. That was mentioned a couple of times. I don't know where that's coming from. We know there are three metabolic pathways when it comes to energy utilization for activity: phosphogene, ATP, glycolytic pathway, oxidative pathway. So carbs need to be available for a portion of the work, and our muscles are always utilizing glycogen. Excuse me, not just carbs, glycogen, because it's about glycogen, not carbs. Our muscles are always utilizing glycogen to function, but that doesn't mean it is the primary. So I don't know where that's coming from. Uh, just to double check, I talked to a couple of people, made a couple of phone calls, actually had a conversation with Dr. Sidis, the carb addiction doc, last night. We did a video interview and we talked about it there. I don't see where that information is coming from. So I'm not sure what's up with that. Okay, getting into the fasted state versus the low carb state. Okay, he in the video he mentioned several times that being fasted isn't the best for physical activity, and I agree with that. I don't think you need to be fasted. I think the idea of fasted workouts is a weight loss hack. It has nothing to do with performance, and in many cases, it can be detrimental because you're not providing your body with the things that you need. Um, so working out after not eating for 8 or 10 hours, that's a whole different discussion for another day. Um, Timing your food and all that other kind of stuff. What I want you to understand is low carb doesn't mean low fuel. It's not the same as fasting. When you're fasting, you're not taking in any nutrition. You're not taking in any fuel. You are relying solely on what your body has to offer. If you are an athlete, and this is the message that you're trying to improve your athletic performance, and you're struggling on low carb, eat more fat. Fat is fuel. If you're not having the energy, if you're not feeling like you're getting the workout quality that you're looking for, you might not be getting enough fuel. Okay. There's also an electrolyte discussion, which he talks about electrolyte and creatine and sodium and stuff like that. Again, those are all things that you need. If you are an athlete, the keys to athletic performance as a ketogenic athlete is allow the adaptation to happen, consume enough fuel, make sure you're getting your electrolytes. Those are the three main things. Okay? If you're not doing those things, if you haven't allowed the adaptation to happen, then you're not going to perform better. And this is some new information that Dr. Cyber shared with me last night. We got into it a little bit. And there's something called the central governor theory. And a lot of times we talk about adaptation in the context of our body's ability to process fuel, getting better at processing fat, okay, becoming ketogenic. And there's a new concept that really gets into this whole thing when we talk about the access of our body's fuel stores, fat or glycogen. And that is our body is never going to run out of fuel. We're always going to have something that we can utilize for fuel. Even let's say we used up every ounce of fat and every ounce of glycogen in our body, we've got protein that we can break down and utilize for fuel if we have to. Okay. But the idea that we're going to run out of glycogen stores has been shown and being shown to be a wrong concept. And there's this theory called the central governor theory, which is it's more about your brain's ability to process and have access to fuel. So in a carb fueled athlete, our brains primarily run off of glycogen. Okay. So when we make that transition to being ketogenic, it's not our entire metabolism that's really the focus of this change and adaptation. It's our brain. Our brain's ability, because our brain controls everything. When our brain starts feeling like it's running low on fuel, it starts shutting down the muscles. It starts shutting down function so that it can preserve its energy source. Okay. So it's more about the liver brain connection with availability of fuel. So as the liver is adapting to creating more ketones, all right, the brain is learning to utilize more ketones. Okay. There's a transition period of adaptation where the brain, when you start reducing the carbs, your brain doesn't know how to use ketones yet. So it's like, I don't know what to do. So my performance functions because it's shutting things down. It thinks it's running out of fuel. So the adaptation is much less about your entire body. It's not about your muscles adapting. It's not about your cardiovascular system adapting. It's about your brain adapting. It's about your liver adapting. Those are the two main components. The two of them working together. When your liver adapts to be able to create more ketones and your brain adapts to be able to utilize more ketones, then you see the shift and that governor gets turned off and your body is able to function now because your brain never runs out of energy. It's not about your body, it's about your brain. When your brain gets to a point where you never run out of energy, it turns the governor off and allows you to do more for longer. You don't bonk, you don't crash, everything works great. When you do ingest carbs, you give your brain a little boost and things go, woohoo, we're good. That's where the performance aspect of using carb supplementation for a competition and competitive activities can be beneficial. Okay, so this is something new. I've never heard of this before until Dr. Saib was talking to me about it last night. We'll get into a little bit more on that talk. He explains it some in really good ways there. So something to think about. Okay, just remember, fasted is not the same as low carb. Very, very different things. Okay, they can have similar effects on the body from a ketogenic perspective, from a ketosis perspective, from an autophagy perspective, from a mitochondrial health perspective, things like that. But the definition of the two is not the same. Okay. All right. So that's the central governor theory. He talks about the difference between a new versus an experienced athlete. Here's my take on that. I don't see how being ketogenic is going to be that different. The adaptation, the physiological adaptations will be different. A new athlete is going to have greater gains than an experienced athlete. But the relative curve and the ability to access and store glycogen should be the same relative to each other and comparative to where they're at in their journey. So someone who's new, who's just getting into exercise, isn't going to be as efficient as at storing and accessing glycogen, as storing and accessing fats. Okay. So as they improve their body's ability to function, those systems, the ketogenic process, ketogenesis, and gluconeogenesis, okay, and the liver, right? That's the liver, the liver's ability to create fat and glycogen, and how the brain processes it. We just talked about the central governor theory, how the brain processes that energy. Those things will improve. Okay. In a experienced athlete, their body is already there. They have the physiological pieces in place. If they're not adapted, then they need to go through the same adaptation period. If they allow that adaptation period to happen, then their processes will improve and be just as efficient as someone who's just got started. So it's less about the physiological condition or experience of the person and more about the adaptation and their ability to provide their body with and utilize glycogen and fats and ketones. Okay, so think about that. He talks about creatine and sodium being more impactful. They are super impactful. And in many cases, I think they can be more impactful than carbs and less negative, less of a net negative than carbs. Okay. They are less of a negative because they are components that support existing function. Carbohydrates force additional function because they're not essential. When you ingest carbs, the processing that your gut has to go through, the processing that your body has to go through to convert those carbs into glycogen is extra work. It's different when your body creates glycogen. Okay? Carbs have to be turned into glycogen. Your body can create glycogen. There's an additional number of steps in there when you're eating it. Okay? That's where oxidative stress, inflammation, and the extra work comes from that cause all the problems, poor recovery, inflammation, everything else. Okay? Something to think about there. Mike talks about relative energy deficiency. Again, not a low carb problem. Okay? A common problem with fasting, people don't eat enough. Okay? But we can't talk about the problems with physical performance being low carb and then reference not eating enough food. If you are in a nutritional deficit, you have a nutritional deficit problem. You were not eating enough fuel. You were not eating enough protein. You're not giving your body the tools that it needs to function. That has nothing to do with being low carb. Okay. I'm not even going to get into the section where he talks about what the recommendations are. I think he basically agrees with me in that the recommendations for carbs are just too much. The idea of training your gut to process carbs, there is something to that depending on what you're doing and how often you're doing it. Again, I don't think a majority of you, most of you listening to this video, watching this video, don't need to worry about this. Okay. If you are somebody who is hyper athletic and hyperactive and working out like crazy and you need to ingest carbs, then just by you taking in the carbs in some managed fashion and following some plan to make sure that you're fueling yourself properly, your gut's going to adapt. It's not a discussion. I think we need to worry about too much about your gut processing carbs. Try to go clean. Try to do stuff that's not high in fiber. Okay, fast dissolving carbs you need for energy, things like that. That's maybe a topic for another day, or someone else to talk about, because I don't have. I think 99% of the people that I really talk to shouldn't be worrying about that. Replenishment of carbs. Again, the recommendations are crazy. 10 grams to 12 grams over 36 to 48 hours. Low carb athletes, if you, again, you've heard me talk about this, your body creates glycogen. You don't need to eat it to make sure that your body has enough. And the whole idea of you running out of glycogen stores in your workouts is way less of an issue than the adaptation period. If you're burning fat, you're not burning as many carbs. Okay, the whole idea of bonking because we're running out of carbs or glycogen in our muscles is being shown to not be a thing. Okay, it's more about your brain. Can your brain access the carbs when it needs it, or is it your brain adapted to ketones? And as long as you have ketones available for your brain, your body's going to do whatever it needs. Okay, because remember, and here's the thing that Dr. Savage brought up in my talk last night is if your muscle glycogen is actually depleted, you wouldn't be able to move. Your muscles would seize. Your muscles would seize. Your muscles primarily utilize glycogen to move. This motion right here is a glycolytic movement. So if I run out of glycogen and deplete my glycogen stores, my muscles would seize. I wouldn't be able to function. So the whole idea of running out of glycogen is something that we need to reimagine, rethink, and come up with some other applications to this concept, because we're finding out it's less about glycogen stores and more about brain function. This is crazy stuff, guys. Okay. Again, my mind is still being blown a little bit by the talk we had. I've got to listen. We talked for almost an hour and a half. I've got to listen to it like 5 times, take more notes, because I think you guys are going to be blown away when you hear that one. All right. So basically, all this to say, guys, I got some other notes here. A couple of things to think about, just in recap. Okay, low carb is not the same as fasted or low energy. Okay, we've got to account for the adaptation period. Okay, you have to adapt. We've got to account for the fact that our fuel storage, we're not running out of fuel. We're not running out of fuel. Okay, if you need more fuel, let's say you are working out so much and you realize my daily intake needs to go up, then just eat a little more fuel. Okay, if you're lean, this is a lean person problem. This is not someone who has 25, 30% or more body fat percentage problem. This is a 10% or less body fat percentage person problem. Okay, is your access to fuel. Okay, glycogen replenishment, you're going to replenish glycogen in between your workouts. You do not need to worry about eating carbs, period. Okay. So that's my thoughts, guys. There's good information, and Mike has a lot of great stuff that he's talking about. I think in this particular video, there's a couple of things based on the premise and the context of where the information is starting to what we're actually trying to do. I want you to take a look at this stuff. See if the stuff that I say makes sense. If it makes sense to you, let me know. If you have any further questions, let me know. Again, I love what Mike's doing. He's helped a lot of people. I just think in this video, there's some clarification and some things that we need to make sure I want to make sure you guys understand how this stuff works. Cool. Take it easy. Thanks for your support.